Hello, I'm Shelley Williams. The topic of my presentation is performance-based funding in higher education, a current issue. Performance-based funding is not new to the landscape of higher education in America. It actually can be linked to the early workings of the Hoover Commission of 1949. Tennessee was the first state in 1979 to implement a performance-based funding model that comprised of a 2% bonus for institutions in the state who met certain outcomes. Today, there is a resurgence in the use of performance-based funding throughout the United States. This can be attributed to the Great Recession and the slow-growing economy since. Also, political polarization in the states, a national and state initiative to expand and increase the number of college graduates from public American higher education, as well as a state focus on their return on investment, which is more commensurate with a marketing model. Currently, there are 33 states exploring the use of performance-based funding in their states, and that is just up from 10 2 years ago. So in just 10 years, 10 to 33 states have begun assessing the use of this particular model. The stakeholders involved in performance-based funding are many. Governors and members of legislature are the driving machine behind its implementation in many states. Faculty and administrators in many states are also involved in formulating the outcomes and intermediate metrics being utilized. Students are, of course, affected in regards to the services they receive or their overall admission to a university. And I'll talk more about that in the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses part of the presentation. And taxpayers are also affected by this model. I'll talk about that more at the end when we talk about the long-term and future implications of performance-based funding in American higher education. First, there are two models. The 1.0 model resembles the earlier model, again, that was implemented in Tennessee in 1979, that is structured more like a bonus. States don't really lose anything if they don't meet the metrics outlined, but they can actually receive a bonus if they meet the outcomes metrics defined by the performance-based funding model. The metrics actually vary and the percentages of bonus vary from state to state. Between 1979, after Tennessee, to 2007, 26 states implemented a 1.0 bonus type model of funding, but 14 failed, and of those 14, 2 tried again. Some of the failures of the 1.0 funding model, this bonus model, can be attributed to the fact that it isn't tied to legislature or a statute. So the power behind the actual policy is limited. The many models had flaws and lacked a measurement of intermediate progress, only focusing on completion, graduation rates. There was a lack of institutional support during this time frame and weak support from the business community. The 2.0 model is actually a different model that is embedded in state appropriations. It calls for a greater transparency than the 1.0 model that I just spoke of, and it also varies by metrics and percentages. Tennessee in 2010 passed the College Completion Act in the state that instituted a 100% performance-based funding model. Since then, states throughout America are evaluating the methods and formula used by Tennessee to determine if they also can adjust it for their own states. With Tennessee, there's a greater focus on intermediate achievement in addition to outcomes such as graduation. When we talk about intermediate intermediate metrics, we're talking about credit thresholds from freshman to sophomore to junior to senior. We're talking about persistence through remedial education, graduation rates, enrollment of minorities or non-traditional students. Institutions can receive additional funding based on high outcomes in those areas. Also, job placement rates are utilized in some states in addition to licensure pass rates as well as certification exams. So the academic impact of performance-based funding can be profound. In some states, it has led to greater course loads and smaller staffing as a result of the institutions trying to be more efficient and optimize their funding. In Tennessee, program consolidation occurred, and also remedial education was removed from four-year institutions altogether, and now remedial courses are only offered at community colleges in Tennessee. In Pennsylvania, there is an 8% performance funding model of appropriations in the state, and part of that focuses on faculty productivity. And in Florida, as an example, the state monitors withdrawal rates from courses, and they assess the performance of professors and factor that into the funding model. Now, there are many who support performance-based funding, mostly politicians and policymakers, but there are others, administrators and presidents who support it, and researchers, and there are many advantages spoken of. One, meaningful accountability criteria and greater transparency of institutions. Another a positive result can be a shift from a focus on outcomes rather than inputs. Today, universities just worry about their admissions and their enrollment and matriculation of students rather than how many students are graduating. Tying funding to outcomes puts more pressure on the universities to help students succeed. Another advantage can be retention. Higher graduation rates can be another, as well as higher job placement rates. So there are also many obstacles and some unintended impact that is highlighted in research currently in current times. Institutional resistance has played a big role in some states in their efforts to implement performance-based funding. Also, there have been instances of concern of gaming of the system where universities lower their goals so that they have deceptive compliance and can attain their goals because they were low to begin with. Also, lack of buy-in from faculty, lack of involvement in funding in faculty in formulating the funding formula can also be challenging. And for many, they're concerned at the university level that performance-based funding will deter innovation, that people will be scared to try new programs and things to help students succeed for fear of failure that could affect their funding. There's also concern about the collection of data to begin with because community colleges do not have the staffing, technology, and sometimes the knowledge or ability to collect good data and maintain good data. And that has especially been an issue in Tennessee in helping community colleges advance their data management. Many are concerned that performance-based funding in the long run will decrease standards of universities and that students will be rejected admission if they meet certain indicators that might relate to the lack of ability or concern that these particular type of student might not persist through graduation. So this could impact access to higher education and equity in higher education. Concerns of faculty and administrations are also paramount. Many are concerned about institutional autonomy, that performance-based funding entails too much oversight, and that institutions will be controlled by public policy, and the autonomy of an institution and the mission of the institution will become so limited. The uncertainty in fiscal planning for a higher level administration is also of importance. The lack of knowledge of knowing how much funding you have makes it difficult to plan. It makes it difficult to plan expansion or growth. The lack of funding to pay out for performance is another issue, and what we're talking about there is that some institutions are concerned that the state may not even be able to pay if the institutions meet their performance measures and 100% performance funding model is in place. What happens if there's no money to pay the institutions? I'm sorry. Faculty fear a pressure to dilute the rigor of their courses or to pass students who should be failed because it factors into the credit threshold formula for funding. So again, this is a compelling issue in higher education today. There are so many competing viewpoints amongst policymakers, politicians, researchers, faculty, staff, administrators. The infantile state of 2.0 models makes it a very insecure time for legislatures and presidents and provosts in higher education in states that are trying to implement very aggressive funding models. And the lack of data proving that funding models are actually going to lead to higher graduation rates and greater retention is also uncertain. The data is inconsistent, and so far there has been no research to prove that performance-based funding model can accomplish those things in comparison to a current funding model in higher education in many states. So on the long term, in the future, it will be interesting to see how this persists and the outcome, and if this current trend will fade away as it did between 1979 and 2007 when so many states failed. However, the implementation of 100% funding model in Tennessee has many people watching, and many states are very active in their attempts to implement a similar model. They hope to be more efficient and to impact our society with those measures. It will be interesting to see the role of student services during this process and how that might change, and the emphasis placed upon the burden of mid-level to professional staff members and how the delivery of their services to students to help them succeed. This might, as a result, expand the nature of student personnel, the field of student personnel, and as a result of that, we could see growth in graduate programs and student personnel services in higher education administration throughout the U.S. Outcomes-based funding can present many challenges in financing, staffing, and programming if funding is based on intermediate factors and outcomes. How can an institution expand its services and help students persist and move on towards graduation if the funding is not there to expand staffing and programming? This will be a great challenge for institutions in higher education today.